Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. The subject here is contrast, clarity and colour. In camera clubs around the world where judges give a critique of the images presented to them, we hear judges say the same things over and over again. The judges will often say that an image is lacking in contrast, clarity and colour. And when an image does lack those essentials, it also lacks appeal, and any wow value that it may have had is also severely reduced. So it makes a lot of sense for us to look at contrast, clarity and colour as a part of these Photoshop for Photographers videos. Good contrast in an image has a much greater importance than I think many amateur photographers appreciate. And the really odd thing is that we can see a contrast slider in the basic tab of Adobe Camera Raw, but we very rarely use that. Contrast is the scale of difference between the dark tones or blacks in our image and the highlights or whites. I often describe this like the Goldilocks story. Images that have low contrast from maybe dull lighting conditions lack appeal, but in bright sun we can sometimes have far too much contrast. So we need the contrast not too high and not too low. We need it Goldilocks fashion, just right. But when we're out with our camera, we have to deal with the light as we find it for most of the time. More importantly, we have to deal with the light and contrast as our camera can capture it, which is very different to how we see it with our own eyes. So here I've opened up a low contrast image. It's just a piece of rock from a beach which attracted my attention, but you can see that it was shot in dull conditions, and that shows in the image. Now, as I've said before, what we tend not to do is turn to the slider about midway down the panel on the right hand side that says contrast. If we step it up, yes, it will improve the contrast. But generally we move the other sliders which generate the contrast that we need. And as you can see, there's 10 of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Probably the most important are exposure, whites, blacks, clarity, some dehaze, and of course colour. So I suppose the obvious question here is, if we need any one or a mixture of these 10 sliders to create the contrast, clarity and colour that we're looking for, how do we know which ones to use, what order to use them, and by what amount? Well, the good news is I think we've got two great ways to assure we get good contrast, clarity and colour. One of those is our own eyes. We follow what we see, but we have a guide to that too. Right at the top of the screen we have the histogram. Now I've just placed my cursor into the centre of that little peak. If you look at the word immediately below that cursor, you'll see that it says exposure. Now looking further down the panel on the right hand side, we've got an exposure slider. So if this peak was stacked up over to the left or over to the right, then there's an indicator that we may need to tweak the exposure a little bit. Here I've got the exposure right in the middle there, so I don't think we need to touch the exposure. But look what happens if I move my cursor slightly to the right. Another panel highlights, and funnily enough the word that appears just below the little peak is highlights, and looking further down the sliders below we have a highlights slider there. But you can see we're probably deficient in some highlights, because can you see this peak comes down and within that shaded area flattens out here? And if I move to the right, you can see the little word changes to whites. We have another slider that deals with whites, and we can see that we're badly lacking in the whites. There's nothing there at all. So what we're trying to achieve here is to stretch this histogram so that it goes from this side to that side. And of course, if I move from the center to the left, we see shadows appear, and we have a slider for that. Then we have blacks, and we have a slider for that. So we get quite a bit of a guide on what we need to do here. And as we move the sliders further down this panel, if we just keep an eye on the histogram, we won't go too far wrong. The one thing to remember with the histogram is that it's a guide only. We must not follow it blindly, because if we'd shot a dark cat in a dark corner, then of course the peak is going to be stacked over on the left hand side of the histogram where the dark pixels are. If we've gone out in the snow and shot a snow scene, then it's quite reasonable to see this peak further over to the right hand side, and in that case that would be perfectly normal. So where would we start with this particular image? Well, if we are short a little bit of the highlights, let's go down to the highlight control and just move it to the right. See the histogram moving a little bit? We're a little bit short of the whites too, so let's move that to the right, and we can go too far with these, of course. So we do have an option here, if we click it, that if we go too far we get a visual warning, but I'm going to suggest somewhere around there looks okay for me at the moment. There's nothing to stop us from adjusting the highlights, the whites, the exposure, then jump back to the whites and tweak those, and then back to the exposure. There's no problem in doing this when we're working with a raw file. When we look at the histogram up here, we can see that we seem to be okay for shadows, but maybe not for the blacks. So let's drop the blacks down a little bit, and we can start to see the histogram looking pretty good. I'll tweak the whites a little more. Now I think, just personal preference, I am going to drop my exposure just a touch, but I'm going to add a bit of clarity. Clarity is like mid-tone contrast, so as I step it up you'll see how it livens the image up. Let me double click and you can see the difference, the before and after. The dehaze, well, we can sometimes use that too, but we perhaps will come back to that a little bit later on. I'm not sure we need it here. And we can move the vibrance. We can certainly do something with the color. So straight away we've put into this image, without too much difficulty, contrast, clarity and color. We've done most of the things which we would need to do if we was manipulating this from a global image point of view. Now you may notice you've got a couple of little blue areas here. These little options at the top of the screen here are what we call clipping warnings. So I've got my shadow clipping warning turned on. So if I go too far with my blacks, you can see we get that royal blue or that strong blue color show up on the image. If we go too far with the whites, of course, we get red show up. Now I'll turn the clipping warnings off so we're not distracted with those just for the moment. But you can see here that we've got quite a difference between the image we started with and the image we have now. But because we're working with a raw file, we can tweak these sliders as many times as we wish. Now from time to time it's quite useful if we can look at the previous or original image and then the image we've just created. Well, if you touch the P key on the keyboard, we can do just that. Now we get to really appreciate the difference between this flat, lifeless picture and the one we've created here. Quite a difference, but we haven't done a great deal of work at all. Now while we've been making the changes we've made, we've had the histogram to give us our guidance. The histogram is something we need to learn how to read. but it's something that comes natural. You don't have to work at it. Just keep your eye on it when you're doing any manipulations in Camera Raw, and you'll find after a short while you'll start to understand how to read it and react to it. I'm going to come back and look at colour with a separate video, I think, because we've got the difference between vibrance and saturation that we need to deal with. But we've also got a set of colour sliders called hue, saturation and luminance, and here we've got 3 tabs and 8 sliders, so 24 ways that we can mess up our picture if we're not careful. But used carefully, they are a great benefit. What I'd like to do next is to open up a completely different picture, and we'll go through the process once more and allow the histogram to guide us. But I may want to come back and do some more work on this when we come back and look at things like the circular filter, or maybe even the color tools. So if I want to lock the changes into my raw file, and when I say the word lock the changes in, it doesn't mean I can never go back to my raw file, but when I click done, the image will be closed down, but all of the changes that I've made will be there for when I need or want to open it again. So as you can see, I've opened up an image here which is going to challenge us a little bit more. It's very high contrast. Remember what I said in the introduction, that we have to live with the contrast lighting as we find it, particularly when we're out of doors, and we also have to live with how our camera captures it, because that's quite different to how I would have seen this as I viewed this when I raised the camera to my eye. When we look up at the histogram, it doesn't look overly bad. We've got a good spread of tones, but we can see we've got some peaks on the right hand side with the highlights. You can see the straight lines going up there. So that's telling us we're losing some detail. We've got, if I put the clipping warning on, you can see that in actual fact we're right on the edge. That little bit of red there is insignificant, and we don't need to concern ourselves with it. But if my picture was something like that, then we probably would. But I think we've got all of the tones we need here, and we've got high contrast, so we've got highlights which are far too bright, and whites which are far too bright, and shadows which are probably a little too dark, but they're not so bad. So let's start with the highlights. Let's bring the highlights down the maximum amount. Already that little clipping warning has disappeared. Do I need to bring up the shadows at all? I'm not sure yet, to be honest. But what we could do with is some mid-tone contrast, because by lowering the whites we've actually taken some of the sparkle off the shot. So let's try a little bit of clarity. Suddenly the image livens up. The image was also shot in the middle of the day, and it's suffering from that intense summer sun, and I think it would be much better, this image, if I just increased the warmth of the image, which is affecting color, of course. But I'm going to do that with my color temperature. This is more personal, but you can see now the color of the timber is beginning to show. I'm going to add some vibrance too. I think that's probably about as much as I want to give. I think the highlights are still a little bit too bright. I hope you'll agree. Let's try taking the whites down. That has a little bit of an effect, but not much. Perhaps the exposure, a tiny amount. But of course when I do that, I start to affect the shadows. But it doesn't matter. We're working in RAW here. We have a shadow slider. So let's step that up a little bit. We can brighten them. Maybe that then encourages me to put a bit more clarity, or even a little dehaze in here. But it doesn't take too long before I can get an image which is substantially different to the one we started with. And if I touch the P key, you can see the difference. You'll also see the image pop because I've applied the lens corrections too. I would need to do a bit more work here, particularly around the edges, but what we've done here is all of that first stage, the global changes. Now we could stop and think about local changes, and the local changes is likely to be the highlight of the tent on the right, the roof of this building here, weaknesses of tone around the edge. They're the sorts of things we would be looking at next. Let me finish quickly with this image. Remember, what we're dealing with here is contrast, clarity and color, but of course it spreads a little wider than that because we're looking at all of these sliders, but we're going to be looking at these again in many different manipulations we do within Photoshop for photographers. But if this image was covered up and we couldn't see the image but we could only see the histogram, even the histogram is giving us a good idea of what this image is likely to look like. We can quite clearly see we don't have any problems with shadows, we've got detail there. But we can clearly see we've got an issue with highlights. But we don't have any straight lines right up the edge, so that's indicating that the highlights are able to be manipulated back into play, if that's the correct way to say it. So once again here, after I've gone to my lens corrections and fixed chromatic aberration and the lens profile corrections, I would be looking as before at the highlights, and as soon as I bring them down, then we get quite a substantial difference. We've got dark areas in the horse and the buggy here, so maybe just a little lightening of the shadows, but now some mid-tone contrast, a little bit of exposure, because a lot of these things we can be guided by the histogram, but there's a degree of personal taste here too. Let's push the colour up. Some people like more colour than others. Some people like more contrast than others. But I emphasize again, what I'm doing here is just that first stage, the global changes. And from here we would move on to the second stage. Now the changes I've made to the images in this video are what I would call the bread and butter changes. They are those first stage global adjustments that we're going to have to make to practically every image we shoot raw. Now once we do that, of course, we would move on to the second stage where we may want to make strategic adjustments, and with an image like this, those strategic adjustments may be a darkening of the foreground to give the image a nice solid base to stand on. We may wish to raise the tones in the buggy just a little bit maybe, and the horse. We maybe want to darken the sky and the top of the building down a little bit to throw more emphasis on the main subject. All those things that we wish to do are partly right and wrong, but there's a huge part of them that are purely personal too. One of the aims in my videos is to try to lower the learning curve that we see with Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw. What we've done here is try to look as best we can in isolation at contrast, clarity and color, but of course you can see the problem. We don't just use the contrast slider, we in fact introduce contrast with a range of sliders, so it's difficult, if not impossible, to demonstrate just one individual tool. At some stage, of course, we need to come back and follow through the whole process to make the global adjustments, which we've just done with our examples here, but then follow on with the strategic adjustments and the finishing touches in Photoshop. A start to finish manipulation.